definitely. Okay, great. We're going to look at this subject today. What kind of God would have only one way? And to help us think about that and to pause before we dive into the subject, it's great to have a friend of mine called Andy here. And Andy's going to be playing tonight at the events, but I've asked him just to sing a song at the beginning that thinks a little bit about this question to start with. Thanks, Andy.
Well, thanks for the welcome. I've been driving for 3 hours to get to you, and it's lovely to be here. The sun's shining in Sheffield. Well, I wrote this song really struggling and questioning something that actually arose from watching a film. And this film was about this girl, this beautiful person, who, though, was carrying this real burden of a sense of wrongness, a sense of guilt. And it's a kind of science fiction film. It's called Another Earth. And the story is unfolding as she's wondering whether somewhere else there's the same person as her, whether she exists, but without this burden of wrongness that she felt she was carrying. After watching this film, I kind of got home and I wrote this song I'm going to share with you now. It's called Is There a Place? Is there a place where I could be forgiven? Is there a place where I could be free? Is there a place of no condemnation? Is there a place for someone like me? Is there a way my wrong could be passed over? Is there a way to lose it in the deepest sea? Is there a way that I could touch heaven? Is there a way that heaven could come to me? I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life, I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life. I hear your voice and it whispers to me. I hear your voice and it echoes in my soul. I hear the voice of loving liberation. I hear the voice of the one who waits to make me whole. I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life, I hear your voice, it whispers to me.
Fantastic. Thanks, Andy. Andy was in that song using those words, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And you may be familiar with the fact those are words of Jesus. He was the one who said those words originally. And we're looking at this question today, how can Jesus be the only way? Because he didn't simply claim to be a way, or a truth, or a option in life, but the way and the truth, the only way. And you might think, well, it's okay for people to hold that opinion, or it would have been okay for them to hold that opinion, 100 years ago, when most people in this country would have been Christian. But how can you hold that opinion today, when we live in a multicultural society, and when clearly lots of people don't believe that Jesus is the way or their way? How can you hold such an exclusive opinion. I grew up in Leicester, not far down the M1, and in my city of Leicester, you can find almost every form of religious place of worship going. Not just churches, but temples and mosques and synagogues and so forth. And how could I, as a Christian, claim that my way was right and that others are wrong? Isn't that a little bit arrogant? And I remember chatting to a student once, and she said, I accept all people, no matter who they are, no matter what they believe. Why can't God do the same? Why would God be so exclusive? So it's really popular, particularly in the West, particularly in a culture like our own, to say, it doesn't matter what you believe, it doesn't matter what religious convictions you hold, they're all equally the same, they're all equally true, and they'll all equally get you to the same place at the end of the day. That's a really popular view. But actually, just by way of introduction, I just want to say 4 things about it. And firstly, what is the evidence for that view? We may like to say, and it may be popular to say, that all religious beliefs are the same. But is there any evidence to support that? Or is it just what I like to believe? For as I'm frequently told by others, we shouldn't just believe something because it's nice or popular, but because it's true. Clearly, there are many people in the world who don't believe that. It's certainly not a universally held belief. A second thing, though, is to say this. When we say that all religious beliefs are basically the same, it can mean that we have to ignore a lot of the real differences between religions. You only had to study religion at school to realize there were some pretty significant differences between religious convictions and beliefs. Someone once said, religious beliefs aren't fundamentally similar and only superficially different. They're fundamentally different and only superficially similar. There's real differences between them. And how do we come to terms with that? I remember when I was at school, one of my religious education teachers liked to use the illustration of the elephants. I don't know whether you've heard about the illustration of the blind men and the elephants. It's not very nice to blind men or elephants, I have to say. But the illustration basically says you've got all these blind men feeling an elephant, and they're all saying, maybe it's a wall because it feels its side, or maybe it's a rope because it feels its tail, and so forth. And the illustration says, well, look, that's basically what religions are like. They're grasping at ultimate reality, all coming to different conclusions. There's at least a couple of problems with that illustration, though, aren't there? The first problem is it's quite an arrogant illustration, because the person that's giving the illustration is basically saying all the religious people in the world are blind people groping for reality, but I can see what they fail to see. So they're claiming to have a revelation that no one else has ever had. And secondly, the problem with the illustration is that they weren't all right, were they? Because it wasn't actually a tree or a brick wall or a rope. It was an elephant. They were barking up the wrong tree, or the wrong elephant, you might say. They got it wrong. They all got it wrong. So actually, religions are quite different. Thirdly, when we talk about tolerance, and I'm not against tolerance, by the way. I think that it's a great thing that we live in a tolerant society. But when we talk about tolerance, and we live in a tolerant society, we presuppose that means we disagree with people. See, if you think about it, you tolerate someone that you disagree with. If you agree with them, you don't need to tolerate them. You agree with them. So tolerance actually, by definition, presupposes that we won't all agree on everything, and that's okay. And then fourthly, no matter how hard we try, we can't actually get away from exclusive claims in life, and in particular to do with religion. Think about it this way. There are really 4 different views you could have about religions in the world. You could say all religions are right and true. Or you might say, no, only some religions are true. Or you may say, no, only one religion is true, and it is whatever. Or, of course, you might say, well, no religions are true. They're all completely wrong. Now, some people say, how exclusive and how arrogant are Christians, because they fit into category 3. They say that there's only one true religion. But actually, all of those views are by nature exclusive, aren't they? You see, if you say that all religions are true, you're going to end up disagreeing with the people in the world who think that some of them, one of them, and none of them are true. If you are going to say, well, only some of them are true, maybe we'll kind of exclude some of the more wacky ones, then still you're going to disagree with the people who say that all of them, one of them, and none of them are true, and so on. Whatever you think about religion, you're not going to be able to agree with everyone else. In fact, whatever you think about truth, because of the nature of truth, you're going to make exclusive claims. So I think it's far too simplistic to simply say all religions are basically the same and all religions basically do the same thing, because they don't. And I think it's disingenuous to any religion to try and make that claim, let alone Christianity. So what might you do then? If all religions aren't the same, and if all religious beliefs are not equally valid, what do you do? What do you say? Well, I guess there's three possible options. The first option is you might say, well, I'm just going to give up. All these religions out there, I haven't got time to look into this, I won't bother thinking about it. But actually, as we'll see in a minute, the claims, particularly the claims of Christianity, are so big that they are worth investigating. And religious beliefs have implications that are worth thinking through. A second option is you might say, okay, what I need to do is I need to investigate all religious beliefs in the world, and once I've studied them all, laid them all out side by side, then I'll come to a conclusion. Of course, the problem with that view is that it's going to take a long time, isn't it? There are a lot of religious claims in the world, and if you're going to wait until you've studied everyone in detail before you make any decision about these things, it's going to take you a while. Although I would have to say, I've got nothing against you doing that. As a Christian, I don't believe Christianity only stands up if you ignore other belief claims. I think it should stand up in the face of them, not by ignoring them. But there's a third thing you could do, and it's that you could start with the claims of Christianity. Now, you might be sitting there saying, of course you would say that because you're a Christian. Well, I guess, yes, I'm biased. I am here speaking on behalf of the Christian Union. But what I'd like to do, just for the final few minutes before we go to questions, is to give you three reasons why I think starting with the claims, particularly the claims of Jesus Christ, are a really good place to start when it comes in our search for truth and our search for answers to the big questions of life. So here's three reasons. Firstly, start with the claims of Christianity because it's unique in the way that you can investigate it. See, how do you know whether a religion is true or not? It's a good question to ask, isn't it? How do you know? It's also a difficult question to ask because a lot of religious beliefs are not objectively verifiable. By that I mean, at the centre, many of them are systems of moral teaching, systems of philosophy, which you may like or dislike, but it's very hard to say that they're true or false. You can say it works for me or it doesn't work, but how would you know whether it's true in an objective sense? Let me give you an illustration. How can I say whether Buddhism is true? I may say I like it, I may decide that it works for me, but how objectively would I prove the truthfulness of Buddhism? It's very difficult. Whether or not the Buddha existed, the system of Buddhism, the philosophy of Buddhism, doesn't really hang or fall on any objective historical event. So it's very difficult to say. Similarly with Islam. How do I know whether the claims of Islam are true or false? The claim is that Muhammad received the words of Allah, as we now have it, the Quran, in a cave. But how would I go about verifying or checking that? Of course, I can read the Quran and I can say whether I like it or not, what I feel about that. But objectively, it's very difficult to uncover whether it's true in that objective sense. But I would say when it comes to Christianity, there is a way that you can start to look at the objective basis of Christianity in a way that's different to other religious claims. Because actually Christianity is not just an idea. It's not simply a philosophy. It's not simply the teachings of Jesus, but it's the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus that's the very foundation stone of Christianity. So much so that the early Christians were willing to say if the resurrection of Jesus didn't happen, then the whole thing should fall down and be rejected as a load of rubbish. But because Christianity is not just an idea, a teaching, or a moral system, but based on a person and an event, it is something you can start to investigate. You can start to look at the evidence for it and discover whether it's true in that objective historical sense or not, which is one of the things that we're trying to do this week. Someone put it this way. They said, look, this is often how religions can start. Basically, someone might have a dream about God, an encounter with God, or an idea about God, and then they communicate to everyone else the idea, the dream, the encounter that they've had. But this is how Christianity started in the first century. After a public ministry, Christ was killed publicly. After 3 days, he publicly rose from the tomb. He showed himself to the public, and then all of those people showed everyone else what they saw. There's a very different way to the start of Christianity, the way Christianity started, to any other religious claim. It was public, it was objective, it was investigable. And it's still that way today. We can check it out and we can look into it for ourselves. And if you're not convinced, we haven't got time to look at it now, but on Friday night, we're going to spend the evening looking at the evidence for the resurrection and looking at some of that objective evidence that we have. So that's the first thing. It's unique in the way you can investigate it. But here's the second thing. It's unique in what it claims, in particular, what it claims about its founder. You see, the conviction of Christians down through the centuries, right back to the first century, is that in the person of Jesus, God hadn't simply sent a prophet or a messenger into the world, but God had actually stepped into human history, broken into the story of this world, and lived on planet Earth as a human being. A massive claim. Now, I know for some of you, you may be thinking, that is just so outrageous, I could never believe it. I would like to say, though, that for the first century believers in Christ, for many of them, it was equally outrageous, if not more so, given their worldview than it is for us. The first century Jews were strict monotheists. And so for them, the idea that God had actually turned up as a human being, lived on planet Earth, died on a Roman cross, and risen from the dead 3 days later in the middle of history, that wasn't part of their worldview, just as it isn't part of ours or our expectations. So you have to ask the question, what was it that convinced these strict monotheistic Jews to come to the conclusion that in the person of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, God had come into human history? And actually, what you see is that it's on the basis of what Jesus said and what Jesus did that they came to that conclusion. Not immediately, but on the basis of all of his life, his teaching, and his miracles. I mean, think about it. What did Jesus say? Jesus repeatedly made claims and said things that only God could rightly really say. He claimed to forgive people's sins, something that offended the religious people in his society because they knew that was something only God could do. But Jesus affirmed that he said that he had the right to be able to do it. He took the name of God from the Old Testament, the I am, Yahweh, and he applied it to himself on several occasions. He said that if you had seen God, if you had seen him, you had seen God. To encounter Jesus was to encounter God. And he accepted people's worship. In fact, when people worshipped him after the resurrection, he didn't rebuke them for what he should have done if he was just a prophet or an important figure. But he rebuked them not for worshipping him, but for being so slow to do it. Jesus said the kind of things that only God could say, but then he did the kind of things that only God could do. So he has authority over sickness, over evil, over nature, and ultimately over death itself through his own resurrection. And the conclusion of these first century people was that in the figure of Jesus Christ, God had broken in to our world. A unique claim that is different to the claim of any other religious leader that has ever lived. Now, I know it's popular sometimes to say that this belief in the divine Jesus grew up, in the 4th century with the politicization of Christianity with Constantine. But actually, that's just not the case. The evidence shows that it was the earliest Christians who were convinced that God had broken into this world in the person of Jesus. And even the enemies of Christianity were aware of this. In fact, if you go to Rome, there's an interesting cartoon, bit of graffiti, that's on a wall in one of the palaces in Rome, clearly made by an opponent, an enemy of Christianity. And you can see possibly that it's a picture of a man being crucified with a donkey's head. And next to it, another man is worshipping. And underneath it says, Alexamenos worships his God. Now, this dates from probably the 2nd or 3rd century, showing that the enemies and opponents of Christianity understood that the Christian claim was that the crucified figure of Jesus was someone that was worshipped and accepted as God himself. And they may have mocked them for it, but they knew that this is the claim Christians were making. So that's the second reason to investigate Christianity. It makes unique claims about its founder. But here's a third one, and this is possibly the most important of all. Investigate Christianity because it's unique in what it offers. Unique in what it offers. See, some of us may class ourselves as religious, others may not. But I guess at the bottom, most of us feel that we kind of know how religion works. Religion basically works in the sense that, we're given lists of rules, regulations, and rituals, things that we have to do. And if I do them really, really well, then God accepts me. And if I don't, then God rejects me. Yeah? I'm in through what I do. I'm out if I don't do it well enough. Now, particularly for those of us that maybe don't class ourselves as religious, we've got a problem with that, haven't we? You see, if being religious is about what we do, then there's really two conclusions that may happen. I may end up being very, very proud, because I figure basically the reason why God accepts me and not you is because I'm better than you. And so I'm going to feel proud because, I'm better. Or, for instance, I may actually look at my life and realize that I'm not better than you. I may be very honest about my own moral failings and realize that I'm not good enough. Well, then I'm not going to be proud. I'm going to be depressed because I'm going to think, well, there's no hope. There's no hope for me. Proud or depressed, either way, it's not particularly going to be very beneficial, is it, for you or for me? That's what religion can lead to. Because religion primarily is about what I do. But at the heart of the Christian message is not what we might call karma, I get what I deserve, but the concept of grace, that we get what we don't deserve. Someone said Christianity is not spelt D-O, it's spelt D-O-N-E. It's not about what we do for God, but what God has done for us. For the heart of the Christian message is that God not only stepped into human history, but that he lived the life we should have lived, and then died the death we should have died. That the way that we can relate to God is not through our own moral obedience, for our own religious efforts, but through his. Through the forgiveness that he makes available through his death on our behalf. That I can relate to God not because I'm good enough, but actually in spite of the fact that I'm not, because he was. And he's done everything necessary so that I can have that connection with God made new and made real. Christianity is not about what I do for God, but what he has done for me. It's based on this concept called grace. Which means that the first step to becoming a Christian is not to think that I'm better than anyone else, but to realize that I'm not better than anyone else and I need forgiveness. Listen to what Bono says in an interview that he was given once. He said, I'd be in trouble if karma was going to be my judge. It doesn't excuse my mistakes, but I'm holding out for grace. I'm holding out that Jesus took my sins onto the cross because I know who I am and I hope I don't have to depend on my own religiosity. That's the heart of the Christian message, that we don't depend on ourselves, but we depend on the one who is dependable, Jesus Christ, who offers that forgiveness to anyone. Now, just think about what that means for a second. If this message of grace is at the heart of Christianity, how is that different to the message of religion that can lead to pride and despair? Can I suggest that, properly understood, that grace should lead to quite the opposite? Firstly, it shouldn't lead to pride, but it should lead to humility. Because to become a Christian is not to accept or to think that I'm good enough, but it's to realize that I'm not. Jesus said he hadn't come for healthy, but for the sick. He hadn't come to call righteous people, but sinners, those who are willing to admit their own failings. Genuinely understanding the Christian message should lead to real humility. But nor should it lead to despair, as religion might. Because actually, although Christians have to admit that they're not good enough, that they need God's forgiveness, they don't go around saying, woe is me, all is lost, and there is no hope. Because a Christian can have absolute assurance and acceptance before God on the basis of what Jesus has done. So they should have real joy. They should have real assurance and confidence, not in themselves, but in the person that they claim to follow in Jesus Christ. Not pride and despair, but joy and humility. That's what the message of grace should lead to. And if you don't think that's the case, well, why not check out and see how this message of grace has affected Christians around here? I meet up very often with a friend of mine who's an atheist. And I remember once chatting to him, and he said to me, the problem with Christians is that they're all so arrogant. And I looked at him and I said, over dinner, and we were sitting there eating away, and I said, look, I'm a Christian. Do you think I'm arrogant? He said, no. I thought, well, he had to say that because I was buying the dinner. So then I said, well, your wife, she's a Christian. Do you think she's arrogant and bigoted? He said, well, no. I thought, well, he had to say that too because I'll go and tell her. So I said, any of the Christians you know here, and I named a few of them, do you think they're like that? He said, no. I said, so why have you rejected Christianity on the basis of this presupposition that isn't borne out in the reality of your experience? In other words, You've got this impression that Christianity is one thing, but that's not what you've actually seen. And we may have the impression that Christianity leads people to be exclusive and arrogant and proud, but is that the reality that you've seen? And is that the reality that's around here? Check out the Christians around here and see how this message of grace has changed them. Oh, and lastly, before we finish, if you think this is exclusive, how arrogant and exclusive is it for Christians to claim that Jesus is the only way? Can I say, although in one sense this is very exclusive, it's also incredibly inclusive. For actually the offer of Jesus is one that is for everyone. Jesus said he hadn't come for white, Western, middle-class people. In fact, Jesus wasn't white, Western, or middle class. And Christianity, historically and today, is not white, Western, and middle class. It's always been a global faith. It's not about a certain ethnic group. It's not about certain cultural practices. It's about knowing God personally through a relationship that's made available by Jesus. And every day, thousands of people come to experience that around the world, in different cultures, from different backgrounds. But they come to find that this is good news for them. In fact, today, the places where the church is growing fastest in the world is not in the West, not in America or Britain or Western Europe, but actually the two countries in the world where the church is growing most quickly at the moment is Afghanistan and Iran. See, the Christian message is for everyone. And the only thing that excludes us will be ourselves. If we choose to say to Jesus, who offers us his forgiveness and this fresh start and this relationship with God, no thank you. He won't force it upon us, but he offers it to each one of us and wants us to enjoy and experience that for ourselves. Now listen, in a moment we're going to go to questions. Just maybe while you're texting in your questions, let me mention two things. Firstly, there's some little feedback forms on your tables. Why not pick them up now, just pass them round with the pens, and take the moments while we're having the questions just to fill us out. Now, what at very least we could do is you could just leave us some comments. Tell us what you think of the events, the food, and everything else. We really do value your feedback. And whilst you're filling out the comments, then there's a number of options there. But let me just highlight the second one. There's an option there that says, tell me more. We're convinced that if the Christian claim even had a chance of being true, it would be worth taking some time to investigate it, wouldn't it? And in an opportunity like this, we're only really scratching the surface. So over the next few weeks, there's going to be a number of opportunities where you can really dig deeper and ask your questions. And we'd love to let you know about when and where those events are going to be. So tick the box that says, tell me more. And then leave it in the tin as you head out in 10 minutes or so. And we'll let you know in 24 hours about that course and what's going to be happening. Okay? So leave your details on that and fill it out. The other thing while you're filling it out is to say there's a bookstall by the door as well. And if you're our guest today and not a member of the Christian Union, you can have any of those books for £1, which is a bargain, okay? So do have a look at the bookstore. But don't worry, we're going to be finished in 10, but I'm going to invite Johnny back up. He's got some questions already, and we'll start on the questions. We'll keep an eye on the time. Don't worry. Over to you, Johnny.
Cool. Okay, so we've got, why would God punish someone who sincerely tries to follow him, even though they might have got the specifics wrong?
Okay, why would God punish someone who sincerely tries to follow him, even though they might have got the specifics wrong? It's a good question, isn't it? Is God just punishing people who are being really sincere? I guess the two things worth saying. One is, sincerity alone in life is not always enough, is it? I may sincerely be convinced of something, but if that thing is not true or not right or not good, then actually my sincerity alone is not going to be enough. I may sincerely believe that poison is medicine, but my sincerity isn't going to make it do any more good for me. So sincerity is not enough. Truth is important, and we need to investigate truth. And actually, many of us have the opportunity to do that. But also, what I'd say is some of us have more opportunities than others. In the West, we have loads of opportunities to investigate the truth claims about Jesus, and we have the opportunity to make up our minds on that. Maybe some people in the world don't have the opportunities that we do. And certainly what the Bible seems to say is that God takes into account the opportunities that we've had to respond to him and the revelation that we've had. The Bible says that everybody has some awareness of God, even if they've never read the Bible. And we're accountable to how we've responded to what we do know, not what we don't know, and what is available to us. I would say, though, for us, we don't fit into that latter category of people who are pretty ignorant about these things, do we? Because actually, even if you've never looked into this, you have got stacks of opportunity to make up your mind about the claims of Jesus. Now, if you choose to reject and say, no, I'm not going to bother, God isn't going to slam himself in your face and say you must. But actually, hopefully, you've heard at least enough today to say, well, actually, I should think about this, shouldn't I? I should look at the person of Jesus and make up my mind according to what he says. Okay? But a great question. Thank you. Good. Anyone want to ask one from the floor before we go to another one from the text? Yes. Great. Yeah. Great. Thanks for your question. I'll kind of paraphrase just for the recording as well. So what about someone, for instance, someone born in Afghanistan or someone who was assumed very early into an Islamic kind of extremist group like the Taliban? Would God judge them because they've had no opportunity to really investigate the claims of Jesus? Yeah? Is that? And I think, this question applies to all sorts of people in the world, doesn't it? Not just people in that situation. You could say, what about people who just have lived in parts of the world but have had no engagement at all with Christianity, no awareness of it? And I think, in one sense, it's a difficult question to answer because, as we've said several times this week, the Bible doesn't give us exhaustive answers to every question we might like to know. It does give us sufficient answers to the questions we need to know. And of course, I'm not in that situation, and so it's slightly different. I think the Bible does give us some clues, though, which I think are helpful. And two of the clues that we have in a book called Romans in the New Testament are that there are some things that everyone in the world could know about God, regardless of whether they've met Christians or read the Bible. Firstly, it talks about how from creation around us, we can be aware of God and the reality of God. And secondly, it talks about how from our conscience within us, we can be aware of something of God's standards. Now, we can choose to reject that and ignore it, and the Bible actually says that many people choose to suppress that, but that's a different thing from being completely ignorant. And what the Bible does say is that what we're accountable to is how do we respond to what we do have available to us, not what we don't, in that sense. So I'm not in a position to say that God is going to judge and send all people to hell just because they've never heard explicitly the name of Jesus. But at the same time, I guess I want to say, we're not in that boat, so I wouldn't want to use that as an excuse for saying, well, it doesn't really matter. I don't need to bother thinking about the claims of Jesus. I think Jesus does take into account, he says, it's more serious for us who have had all these opportunities and still choose to reject it than it will be for those that had no opportunity in the first place. Okay? It's a really good question there. I'm sorry we can't give a kind of complete, maybe completely satisfactory answer, but I think that gives us somewhere to go with it. Should we go to another text one? Is that another? It's the same as that. Oh, that was the same one. Okay. Okay, any other questions from the floor? There was someone over there. Okay. Oh, you've just texted it. Oh, has it come through? Okay. Sorry, do you want to speak it out loud? Is that all right? Okay, sorry. Okay, so you're saying there's connections between Christianity and Judaism before and Islam afterwards. What do I think about the idea of the Trinity as a... Yeah, good question. So clearly there are similarities between the kind of Abrahamic faiths, as you might say, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And as you rightly say, one of the key differences is the understanding of the person of Christ. And who is Jesus? Is he a prophet? Is he God? Was he the Messiah? Those kind of questions are really key. And they are really key because actually the heart of Christianity is the person of Christ. And so we can't just say, well, we'll basically agree to disagree on the person of Jesus because everything else is the same. Actually, if you take away the person of Christ and the idea that God has stepped into human history in the person of Jesus, actually you're taking away the very heart and the foundation of the Christian faith. I think it's worth saying that in the first century, most of the early Christians, at least initially, were Jews, people who were convinced monotheists, for whom the idea of a man being God was completely preposterous, a completely wrong idea in terms of their thinking. And actually what you see in the Gospels is not people immediately saying, oh yeah, Jesus, of course he's God. But actually that slow realization through the course of Jesus' life, death and resurrection, of the accumulation of the evidence of Jesus' life and teaching, that actually the only right conclusion to make about Jesus is that God actually had stepped into human history in the person of Christ. And there were many Jews then who came to accept that, and there are Jews today in the world, including a good friend of mine, who would say, look, I'm Jewish by ethnicity and by birth, and I've come to accept Jesus as the Messiah. But he wouldn't deny his Jewishness in doing so. He would see Christ as the fulfillment of his Jewishness. I guess looking forwards, there's a real key difference, isn't there, in the Islamic understanding of Jesus and the biblical understanding of Jesus. And I would say that's a really crucial difference, which is why I think looking at something like Luke's Gospel is going to be a really important place to start. Because who's going to be in the best place to give us accurate information about the person of Jesus? I think the eyewitnesses that were there, the documents that were contemporary to the person of Jesus, the ones that were distributed at the time. And so we'd love you to take away and have a read. And not just say, you must believe Jesus is God because I said so, but actually read through with an open mind and say, what do I think on the basis of the evidence that I've had here? And what am I going to think given that? Okay? Great question. I'm just conscious of the time. We're pretty much out of time in a second. Johnny's got a couple of notices. I'm sure you've probably got lots more questions. So we're going to have a 20-minute break before the next lunch bar starts. In the next lunch bar, we're going to be looking at the question of suffering and why God doesn't prevent it. So we would welcome you to stick around for that one if you've not got to rush off to a lecture. But also stick around and talk more and ask your questions. That would be really helpful. Maybe, of course, you've got to rush off because you have got a lecture. Well, why not leave your details in one of those feedback forms? Leave it in the tin as you head out, and then we can get in touch. We'll meet up for a coffee or something like that and chat more about these things. That would be really helpful. But I'll hand back to Johnny for now.